Hello and welcome to Class 8 of History 1378. I hope you're all doing well so far uh, as I open up every class. If you have any questions, go to Blackboard. The TAs have been putting up notices about things like extra credit and testing. If you have any questions about that, contact the TAs. They're the ones who actually handle the grading part of it, so it's probably easier just to contact them first. You can obviously contact me as well, but if it has something to do with like extra credit or the test or something like that, I generally forward it to the TAs, and you each, know who your TAs are. It's on the syllabus. Most of the questions, I get a lot of emails. Most of the questions I get can be answered by the syllabus or just by looking at Blackboard. If you have any questions about the books, contact Nunn McGinty. It's on the, I think that's on the syllabus through the website, and they can get you through whatever issues you have with that. So hope you're all doing well, keeping up to date on the reading especially, and obviously these videos as well. So today we're going to continue talking about the Depression, the Great Depression, somewhat more timely probably this year given what's happened in 2020. The economy this year in 2020 is probably the biggest economic crash, the worst economic conditions we've had since the so-called Great Depression of 1929 and into the 1930s. Actually, it lasted quite some time with massive hardship, which is why when I started talking about it the last time, I started by showing you images of what the Depression actually did. Because today we'll talk about the causes of it, and sometimes when you talk about economics, it can seem kind of cold and complex or impersonal. But keep in mind the real issue when an economy goes bad is that it damages people, it harms people. We see that in 2020, right? With about a third of Americans either missing a house payment or facing eviction. 10 million or so people without health insurance. Huge numbers of people. I think 50 million people at one point this year already have filed for unemployment benefits. Huge job losses in some industries not coming back, like entertainment and the service industries and things like that. So this is kind of a timely topic, right? The Depression of the 1920s and 30s, talking about it in 2020. Economic conditions are very different. The economy, the American economy, is different by a lot than it was a century ago. But some of the economic conditions that existed in the 1920s and the 1930s are similar to what they are today, and really are kind of similar whenever you see some kind of big economic downturn. There are simple simple, by simple I mean like kind of singular elements of the economy that are important no matter when, no matter what time period you're dealing with, no matter what century you're dealing with. Crises and things like trade and investment and production or overproduction or lack of consumption are going to be a problem no matter what, no matter when, in 2020, 1930, 1873, whenever. 1898. So you're going to have similar circumstances. So talking about the Depression of the 1920s and 30s and some of the causes of it it's going to, kind of make you think about a lot of stuff that's happened far more recently than that. In your generation alone, you lived through the Great Recession, as it was called, of 2008, 2009. And now whatever name they attach to this, is so. What we talk about in the 20s and 30s is going to actually kind of in some ways ring a bell. All right. So let's get the outline up so we can kind of go from there. And this is where we were last week with images of the Depression. If you're interested in it, the government has a ton of different collections of imagery from the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, which I'll talk about briefly. Just that was a whole decade of crisis. All right. So we talked about what it actually meant when the Depression hit. Before we talk about what actually caused it, which is a lot of stuff, I wanted you to see those images and remember, keep that in your mind all the time, that the people most affected when the economy goes bad are people who are kind of most on the edge anyway. So there were a lot of very rich people who remain pretty wealthy when the Depression hit, but it's always people who are like at the lowest levels who were the first ones affected, as we saw this year, right? And that was clearly the case in the 1920s and 30s. Massive numbers, probably bigger. I mean, at the height of the Depression, probably a third, maybe more, % of Americans were unemployed. You didn't have a whole lot of safety programs like unemployment like you would have today. So people generally relied on private charities, you know, go to a church and get like a bowl of soup or a blanket or something like that. So it was really a catastrophic human crisis, and that's the first thing to keep in mind. It's also occurring at the same time as the Dust Bowl, which is just this horrible environmental crisis. So you have this, you know, this massive economic crisis on top of this environmental crisis. You know, like in 2020, right? We have this massive economic crisis, and you have wildfires and hurricanes and global warming and all that. So when all those things occur at the same time, it really causes a crisis in the entire system. So we can talk about systemic crises, and the environment was one in the 1930s, just as it is today, right? And it affected people. People lost their homes, people lost their jobs, people lost their livelihoods. A lot of people suffered and died. Because of the Dust Bowl, rates of asthma and things like lung cancer went up significantly because in the plains area, like around, you know, kind of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, where there's a lot of farms today, Iowa, Texas, farmers had just wiped out all the forest. They just cut down all the trees and they just planted all over the place. And then there was a long drought. And so all of that land, which is just barren, right? It's flat, became hard. And then when winds would come through, they would kick up the dust and create these massive dust storms. So, you know, you could sweep your house at night and in the morning, wake up and have several inches of dust, you know, which is getting in people's lungs, is making people sick. It's going all over the country. People in the New England area were getting red snow that winter. In the winters, because the dust from the Midwest had, you know, a lot of it was clay, had been lifted and sent that far away, right? I mean, today in Europe, some of these places are getting dirty air because of the fires in the western coast of the United States, 5,000-6,000 miles away. So these are climate crises, catastrophic natural crises, man-made natural crises. The decisions to do farming the way they did in the 30s was the reason for the Dust Bowl. They just wiped everything out. And so you had an economic and an environmental crisis at the same time. Again, you know, kind of like what we're dealing with right now today. All right. So what we're going to do is talk about the causes of the economic crash, the Great Crash of 1929. Remember, which occurred at a time of economic growth. The economy was doing great for several years before that. But then you started to see these problems occur around 1927, 1928, and then boom, everything just kind of fell apart after that. And so we're going to talk about the causes of that today. I think these are roughly the page numbers where you can get it in the book, which you really need to do. Make sure you read all this. Like I've said many times before, I go over stuff that's, you know, sometimes fairly quickly, or sometimes I don't even talk about it, but that doesn't mean it's not important or that we're not, you know, expected to learn something about it. So make sure you do all the readings, you know, when we talk about this stuff, because I go through it fairly quickly. All right. So we're going to talk about the causes of the Depression, which occurred from around, the crash occurs in 1929, and it really continues all the way through the beginning of World War II. So it lasts, you know, pretty much a decade. There are several causes here I'm going to talk about. They are connected. I have them in a particular order, but that doesn't mean that one is necessarily more important than the other. They're all interconnected, so they all, you know, there are bad situations, you know, existing on their own, and then when you put them together, it creates even a greater, much worse situation, a much greater economic crisis. So that's what we're going to talk about. And again, I think it's useful and important because 2020, you know, you're seeing stuff in 2020 that isn't necessarily all that different than it was in 100 years ago, or almost 100 years ago. So the first one is a term which I brought up before in 1898, surplus capital, which is kind of like, actually, again, something we're seeing today. The idea behind capitalism, behind capital, is that you get more of it and you invest it. So the idea of capital is money that you use to produce something, to make something. It's used for a productive purpose, right? It's not just money you spend, or money you use to buy something. It's money you use to create some kind of production right? So capital can build a bank, capital can build a factory, capital can build, a resource company so that you can mine coal or copper or something like that. So there's a lot of things you can do with capital. And the idea there is once you do that, once you produce something, you get, the money back from it and you invest it further. You reinvest it. So it's growing and growing and growing. It keeps growing. You need capital so you can build bigger. And if that stops, then you have a problem. Like in 1898, we talked about that, how you had all this capital, but, they'd made pretty much everything they needed to make. And so there wasn't a whole lot of, places, there weren't a whole lot of places where you could invest that money and make money off of it. And so it sits there. It's surplus capital. It's a lot of money, billions, right? But it's not being put into new production. So it's just sitting there. It's surplus, which, if you're rich, wouldn't seem like it's a real problem. But for an economy based on capitalism, it is, because you need this stuff to keep going and keep flowing. Get money, build something, sell it, get that money back, get that profit back, reinvest it, build more, and so on and so on. Well, that wasn't happening. Okay, to make a long-winded point short, by 1928 and 1929, there was a significant amount of surplus capital. I think before I'd mentioned that the first stage of capitalism was producers' capitalism, not consumer capitalism. So in the first stages, capitalists are making things for other big capitalists. They're making factories, they're making machines, they're making railroads. They're not making things that you or I as a consumer would buy. They're making things that other capitalist producers would buy. By the 1920s, as I said the other day, you start to see, and there's a lot of it in the book about that. There's a list of stuff in the book that you see in the 1920s come out of the consumer's economy. So now businesses aren't just making all of that big stuff because you have most of the factories and railroads and things like that you need. Now businesses, factories are producing goods for consumers. And like I said, canned goods, radios, vacuum cleaners, irons, things like that, right? But even then, you can only make so much. Most people in the United States aren't that well off. They're living on the edge. So even when you make goods that people can purchase, like radios and ice boxes and washing machines and things like that, not everybody in the United States can buy one. So again, you kind of make everything that you can get rid of. And at that point, you still have all this capital left, right? So a lot of these big capitalists, people who own factories, people who own resources like coal mines or copper mines or something like that, people who own banks have a lot of extra capital, a lot of extra cash that they're not able to invest because there's really no place to invest it, okay? So why is that? Well, on one hand, like I said, they've sold most of what they can sell, right? They sell cars, we'll talk about cars are a big deal. In the 1920s, a huge deal. People buy automobiles, and there's a lot of stuff in the book on this that you need to read. People buy cars, for the first time in large numbers in the 1920s. And that was helped with things like, remember when we talked about loans, how consumer loans were really important. Henry Ford made a car that was cheap enough for his workers to buy it. He paid his workers more than anybody else in the industry did. Paid them $5 a day instead of $2.50 or $3 a day. But then he enabled them to purchase cars on company credit. So even though he was paying them more, he's selling them cars, right? But again, not everybody in America. I mean, today everybody in America has a car or two in Texas, right? But in the 1920s, the majority of Americans still, even though cars are now affordable for a lot of people, they're still not affordable for most people. It's not just rich people anymore in the 1920s who buy cars. Some people who were, the word middle class is so big in general, I don't know what it means, but, let's say middle class people could buy cars, but working people who still make up the majority of America can't afford to buy an automobile. So even though you have all this surplus capital, you make all these goods, you still have made enough, you've made more than people really need. And so you have all this extra capital on hand now, and you need to do something about it. Right? You need to find a place to invest it. You need to find a place where you can make something, where you can produce more goods, where you can sell more stuff, where you can get more money back, and then reinvest it and keep getting bigger and growing and so on. All right. Now, in the 1890s, remember, there was a problem with surplus capital. Remember, Charles Conant talked about that a lot. And Conant's answer was to go to Asia, go into the Pacific and start looking for markets there. This is why one of the reasons the United States takes over Hawaii, it takes over the Philippines. It's interested in getting markets into Japan and China, right? But in the 1920s, that idea of finding markets abroad isn't going to work like it might have worked in the 1890s. And why is that? Well, what did I say last time or the time before that? I said, when we get to the Depression, I'm going to go back and talk about the problems at Versailles, the mistakes they made. And so that's where we are now. The failure to find a decent solution to the crisis in Europe after World War I directly led to the great economic crashes of the 1920s and 30s and to the rise of Hitler. So that's where we are now, right? And so along with all this surplus capital, normally you would say, okay, we can invest it abroad, but you really can't do that in the 1920s, in the late 1920s, because of a series of foreign economic crises directly connected to the failure to achieve some kind of decent, reasonable, useful, efficient, workable settlement regarding the end of World War I, especially with regard to Germany and the reparations, all right? So what's that mean? At the end of the war, remember, Germany was given a $33 billion reparations bill, massive amount of money. And people like John Maynard Keynes, who led the reparations committee, people like Wilson said, that's way too much. They'll never be able to do it. It will destroy the German economy, which is kind of what the British and French wanted to do. Well, that's what happened. And so in the 1920s, the German economy is just crushed. It has to pay these reparations. So what it does is it creates goods. It makes, it mines coal, it makes steel, and then it sends that to France and Britain to pay for the reparations. Well, the Germans are getting kind of tired of it because, you know, they're doing all this work and they're not keeping any of the, you know, the production. They're not keeping the resources, the iron ore or the coal or anything. They're not keeping the steel. So the Germans just kind of slow down. They just say, you know, we're not getting anything anyway, so what's the incentive to keep making goods? And so you have a slowdown in Europe. So the economy in Europe is stuck. And when the German economy is bad, then the British and French economy are bad too, because they're also connected. They make goods along with each other. They sell goods to each other. They're markets for each other. They invest in each other's countries. They get raw materials. They invest. So when Germany falls apart, when Germany gets crushed at the end of World War I, then it's going to have an impact on all of Europe. I mean, Germany has wicked inflation. Germany, you know, people can't pay in Germany to get, like, you know, milk and bread. They bring huge bags of money just to get, like, you know, a loaf of bread or some milk or something like that, because the economy has been inflated so badly it's kind of worthless. So there's a massive economic crisis. And a lot of this was caused by the problem at Versailles. And this is one way to look at it, right? So, and this is just from 1924 and 1930. The US came up with two ideas, Dawes and Young plans to fix this situation. But let me kind of describe the crisis first, all right? So the Germans have to pay the Allies, Britain and France, reparations. So that's $2 billion in a year, right? So Germany, in order to pay the Allies these reparations, produces, like I just said, steel and coal and things like that, right? So they do that to pay the Allies. But now, ideally, theoretically, the Allies, the French and the British, would take that money and use it to build up their own economy. They would start producing goods in their own factories or, you know, in their coal mines or whatever, but they don't. Instead, Germany sends this money, reparations money, to Britain and France. So what do? Remember, how did they finance the war? They borrowed a ton of money from the United States, a huge amount of money. So they have those debts now. So when they get that money, those $2 billion in that period from Germany, Britain and France, instead of keeping it and making up their own manufacturing deficits, send it to the United States, right? So they send $2.6 billion in war debts to the United States, okay? So Germany isn't making anything because they're sending their products and their money to Britain and France. Britain and France aren't making anything because they're paying off their debts to the United States. Now, this is why Woodrow Wilson at Versailles did not want to give Germany a huge reparations payment. He wanted Germany to be able to rebuild. He figured if Germany could get its factories going, start to rebuild, then the other Europeans could purchase goods from Germany, sell goods to Germany, invest in Germany, get raw materials from Germany, and Germany could do the same to Britain and France and the United States, and they would all be part of a functioning international global system, all right? In 2020, think of the problems, like the disconnections now we have because of the tariffs with the United States and China. There's this like tariff war that's been going on for a couple of years, and now, you know, WeChat and TikTok are being dragged into it, and Huawei and 5G and all this kind of stuff. So it creates, when there's a lack of economic activity, when there's something like kind of a barrier to it, or when something like these debts and reparations occur, then it's gonna muck up the whole global international, the whole global economic system, not just one or two countries, and that's what's happening here. So the United States says, we got to do something about this. You know, now there were some people saying, why don't you just cancel the debts? Just say, you know what, take the money, use it to rebuild your own country, and then that way it'll reinvigorate the global economy. We'll be okay. But the people who led the United States in the 1920s, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, it was a decade of Republicans, refused to do that. So they insisted that Britain and France continue to send them all the war debts in full, right? They wouldn't even readjust it. So even though they knew that Germany, Britain, and France were in bad shape, they insisted that all of these debts be paid. But, so they're getting 2.6 billion in war debt payments. But they also said, well, maybe if we help Germany, then that'll, you know, Germans will get back on their feet and it'll kind of create some kind of activity. So between 1924 and 1930, the United States came up with several efforts. The most important were the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan to give loans to Germany. So the United States sent $2.5 billion in loans to Germany, all right? Now, ideally, what would Germany do with that money? This is when it's really nice to be in class and we could ask questions and I could say, what would they do with that money? And most of the time, you know, a lot of people understand what they would do, right? They would take that money and they would invest it in their own production. They would mine coal, they would make steel, railroads, whatever, but they can't, right? So that 2.5 billion in loans goes to Germany. What does Germany do with it? They send it to Britain and France. And then what does Britain and France do with that money? They send it to the United States, and so on. So it's a triangle. It just keeps going, right? Ideally, not ideally, you have to. I mean, according to what capitalism is, that money has to stop and be invested into production. It has to be put to productive use. You have to do something with it. You have to grow something with it, build something with it, make something with it. And in this particular case, it's just going around, right? And it's not stopping, and nobody is getting a cut in order to put factories back to work, to produce goods, to make things, to sell things, to buy things, or anything like that. So as you can see, you have a real problem because you have all this surplus capital, right? And the United States uses some of that. Oh, we can send loans to Germany, right? Invest in Germany like they did in 1898, you know, invest abroad. But the problem there is that, you know, it doesn't create any kind of economic activity because Germany takes that money, sends it to Britain and France, and then Britain and France send it back to the US and so on. So the money never stops. It never gets put into any kind of usage. So it's just kind of sitting there. It's surplus capital. It's kind of dead money, all right? It's not making anything. So, so you have surplus capital and the inability to invest it abroad like you normally would in a situation like that. Foreign investments are always important for times when there's surplus capital, right? And so, you know, it's really important to keep global trade continuing, right? Well, that didn't happen. So since you have these foreign economic crises, since Britain and France are in really bad shape economically, what happens is that you have a massive decrease in global trade. And we're seeing that, you know, kind of like, you know, today with tariffs, right? So in 1929, America had $3 billion in global trade, in international trade, foreign trade. In 1933, that was down to $900 million. So that's only 30%. So in just 4 years, you saw a 30% decrease in trade. And this is like, this is just, if you want to see it on a graph, right? So in 1929, you had basically $3 billion. And here you have 990 million. So this is now, what does this mean when there's not trade, right? Well, it means that people aren't making the stuff that you would normally sell. right? So people in the United States who make things that would be sold abroad probably are going to lose their jobs. They're going to shut down factories because nobody's buying anything. The same is true of Britain and France and other countries. This trade restriction is hurting them too, so they're going to make less stuff. People who work on the docks, loading and unloading stuff, they're going to lose jobs. People who finance businesses like bankers, they're going to have a problem because nobody's really doing business anymore. You're trading a lot less stuff. Importers and exporters are going to suffer because trade is down so much. So these foreign economic crises make everything worse. You have all the surplus capital, which normally you would invest in something like foreign trade, but because of that debt triangle where Europe is still suffering even worse from the end of World War I, and because of this huge decline, like this graph shows, in global trade, that surplus capital just continues to sit. There's nowhere to put it, right? So this is where we get to something I'm sure you've heard of. What do you do with all that money, right? You don't hide it underneath the mattress. You don't dig a hole in the backyard. You have, we're talking like billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars that need to be invested. And normally you would invest them in places like Germany or Britain and France, but because of the problems like Versailles and the reparations, you really can't do that. Global trade has just hit the skid, so there's really no place to invest there. So all of these people who have all this huge money decide to invest in the stock market. They invest in the stock market. All right, now, again, 2020 is somewhat like that. What we've seen this last few years is the market has gone up tremendously. The market has generally gone up for a couple of reasons. One, massive tax cuts in 2017 gave the top 1% of Americans something like $1.6 trillion extra. Now, instead of using that to build anything, what they did was buy back their own stock or invest in the stock market. So the market kept going higher and higher. And then the second reason in 2019 to 2020, is that the Federal Reserve keeps creating money, trillions of dollars, and makes that available to Federal Reserve banks. And then rich people borrow huge amounts of money to purchase stocks with it, all right? The same thing was happening in the 1920s, 1927, 1928, 1929. All of these people have massive amounts of unused capital because they've sold all the stuff they can sell. They've made all the stuff they can make. The European market's a mess. Global trade is way down. So they invest in the stock market. They take all of this money and they start buying stocks. Now, what happens? If you have a huge amount of money and you purchase a stock, then obviously the price of that stock will go up, which makes it more desirable. And other people will notice that and they'll say, oh, that's a good stock, it's going up. So other people will start purchasing that stock as well. This is occurring throughout the stock market. So you start to see this incredible increase in the price of stocks in the late 1920s, 1927, 1928, 1928. A lot of these are companies, IBM and Ford and GM and things like that, that are still around today. And they're seeing big increases, which means people are making a lot of money, right? But the idea behind a stock market being, like the idea behind capitalism, is that you take that money and you use it to do something. You produce something with it. You make something with it, right? Well, that's not necessarily happening because there's nothing to make and there's no place to really trade. So the stock market is going up and up. It is inflating because people are buying stocks. Why is the stock market going up? Because people are investing in the stock market. Why are people investing so much in the stock market? Because the stock market is going up, right? It's not based on production. It's based on investment in the market itself. And it creates what we call a bubble, right? Think of a balloon, right, that expands as you put more air into it. Well, that's kind of what's happening in the stock market. You keep investing capital because you have it and there's no other place to put it. So I'm going to buy stocks, and let's say this stock is at 30 or 40 bucks, and I purchase a bunch of it, and then it goes up, and then other people see it go up and they start buying it. Pretty soon it's at 50 or 60 bucks, and other people say, oh, I want to get on that. Pretty soon it's even more than that, right? $80, $90, and if you bought in early at $30, you buy who knows, millions of shares, you're incredibly wealthy right now. And people are doing that because they have all this excess capital, this surplus capital on hand. So they're just buying stocks, and the stock market is going up and up and up and up and up. But it's a bubble. It's not creating things. It's not making things. And what happens if you keep putting air in a balloon, if you keep blowing in a balloon, right? Well, you know what happens. It's going to pop. And that's what happened to the stock market in the late 1920s. All of these people had put huge amounts of money. Well, not all of these people, these wealthy people who had surplus capital, bankers and investors and people like that, had put huge amounts of money in the stock market, and they'd made a lot of money in the stock market. And then at some point, especially as you get closer to 1929, people are starting to get a little edgy, a little nervous, a little anxious, because they have a lot of money invested in the stock market, right? And a lot of people, especially those who got in early and made a lot of money, start to take money out. They've made a profit, so they start to withdraw. And that creates kind of a run on a market. It creates this kind of psychological condition where people panic. And that's the reason these things were called panics before 1929, actually. But they were always called economic panics because people would panic. Now today, you go online, you go to E-Trade or whatever, and you can do the trade right there. But you didn't do that in the 1920s. You actually had to have a trade that had to be physically conducted. So you had to call somebody who actually made that trade. So by October of 1929, a lot of these folks who invested in the market want to get out because the market is inflated. It's way beyond what it should be. If you ever feel like studying this, or if you're interested in it, like in 2020, just do some research on price to earnings ratios, right? And that'll tell you a lot about what's going on in the stock market. The market's overpriced, right? In 1929, it's wildly overpriced. So people start to sell off. Well, that creates a panic. When people start to see others sell off and the price of stock going down, a lot of them do the same. Well, pretty soon the stock market just is at bottom. And a lot of people who invested when it was higher are starting to lose all their money. They're in trouble, right? They've lost everything. And this isn't just individual investors. In fact, that's probably a minority of it. Most stock market investment is done by a very small number of people. Like today in the United States, something like 1% of Americans have about half the stock, and the top 10% have like 90% of the stock. Most people beyond that have stock through a pension plan. So these folks who've invested heavily, they're not just individual investors, they're banks, they're corporations, they're insurance companies who have corporate investments, massive corporate investments in the stock market. It's when the market crashes, when everybody starts to pull out and the price just flops down, just hits bottom very quickly, all these people have lost their money. It's gone. That bubble burst. And so all that surplus capital, which could not be invested in Europe or in global trade because that was going so badly, is put into the stock market. Now, some people got out early and did well, but most people, weren't able to do that. They didn't have the type of investments, the amount invested. You have to have a lot of money, right? And so most people didn't. So that created a massive crash in the price of stocks, and it hurt individual investors, it hurt banks, it hurt corporations, it hurt insurance companies, it hurt anybody who was invested in that, right? So that's how the stock market crash occurred. Now, generally, when we talk about the Great Depression, if I were to say, what's the Great Depression? A lot of you would probably say, well, it's the economic crash, the stock market crash of October of 1929, right? Which, is what you always hear. So, it's certainly not wrong. But that crash wasn't the cause of the depression. The stock market crash did not cause the depression. It actually basically confirmed it. A lot of people, because of the reparations crisis, because of the decrease in foreign trade, saw that there were problems already. So there were people in 1927 and 1928 saying, hey, man, things are getting bad and we better do something because it's going to get worse. And most people didn't. So when the stock market crashed, even though we say that's the cause of the Great Depression, it's actually kind of proof of the Great Depression. It's proof and evidence and confirmation that something bad was pretty much inevitably going to happen, right? In late 2019 and early 2020, before the COVID crisis occurred, a lot of people were writing about, economic problems that were going to occur. So a lot of the stuff that's happening today, obviously, is due to COVID, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of it were just kind of market conditions that were kind of inevitably going to happen. A lot of it was because of the tariffs, which have been going on for a few years, tax cuts, things like that. And that was the case in the 1920s too. So when the stock market crashed, a lot of people, said, "Oh, this is what we kind of expected." And there's a massive crisis, right? About a third of Americans are out of work, and people are, they can't be fed. They're going through dumpsters and garbage cans looking for food. It's a bad situation, much like, the images we saw here, and, we still see here of people in food lines and things like that. So you have among the causes, and these are connected, right? You have all this extra money, surplus capital, no place really to invest it because of these foreign economic crises. So they invest it in the stock market, and that goes bad, right? So what else? Well, in addition to that, you have, which in many ways is probably the most important thing, right? Poverty. There's just a lot of poor people. So most people, even though the economy grew so considerably in the 1920s, there's a lot of people working in the United States. The population of the US in the 1920s is somewhere in the 120 million or so range. So most Americans are still pretty poor, and they can't buy all those things like cars and radios and electric irons and washing machines that were being made for that consumer economy. So most people are poor, and they remain poor. Most people live below the official poverty line, and the official poverty line is always way below what people really can live on. So generally, globally, poverty figures are somewhere in the 15 to 20% range. But in reality, if you look at what people would really need for a decent life, it's way bigger than that. And so that's clearly the case too. So you just have a lot of people who are poor. And when you're poor, you can't buy anything. And when you can't buy anything, then you can't participate in the economy. And people can make stuff, but if you don't have any money, it doesn't do you any good. So there's massive poverty, and the lack of economic activity, the lack of trade, factories closing, people aren't buying as many things, creates great problems. All right. Now that's kind of connected here. This idea, which is also one of the causes, it says lack of economic diversity. Right. That's kind of a fancy way, I guess, of saying that the United States did not have a whole lot of industries that were big enough to either keep the economy going or make the economy suffer, right? It's like today, if a Middle East, if the price of oil gets really bad, if the price of oil goes really low, oil-producing countries like Middle Eastern countries suffer because they rely on oil so much. Well, in the 1920s, you had more stuff being made, but the overwhelming amount of production and the amount of capital in the economy was based in the automobile industry and the construction industry. Those were the biggest, all right? Beyond that, you had others, but those two were the biggest. So if those industries have problems, then the whole economy will have problems. So cars, for instance, the idea behind a car, you make money off of it by selling somebody his or her first car, right? Because after that, people often buy used cars, and you're just buying them at a lot or buying it from a friend or something like that. So car companies need to get people to buy new cars in order to really make a lot of money. By 1927 and 1928, most people had a new car who could afford it. So by that time, the number of new car sales started to go down. Now, that's important for a lot of reasons. I mean, the auto industry is really important, but what else is important? Well, what are cars made out of? Steel, rubber tires, glass, you need gasoline. So when people stopped buying cars in the same numbers that they had bought before, when most people had already purchased their first car, and the numbers started to go down, all of those industries suffered. Automobile industry, the steel industry, the glass industry, the rubber industry, oil industry, petroleum industry for gasoline, road building. People started to travel, and they started to, people would put up, others along the way would make, motels and diners and things like that. People are probably doing less of that. So when the auto industry starts to recede, to decline, it has a huge effect on all of these other industries that are connected with it, right? A car has, it has steel, it has glass windows, it has leather, it has rubber tires, it has, tools in order to fix it, mechanics at gas stations where you get gas, you get your car serviced. So when cars start to recede, all of those businesses start to recede with it. And the same thing in construction. by the late 1920s, people just started building less because pretty much what they needed was up, building roads, building buildings, and so on. But between like 1927, 1928, 1929, there was a several billion-dollar decrease in construction. I think it went from like 11 billion to 9 or 8 billion. So it's pretty significant decrease in construction. So when those happened, when the car industry and the construction industry both kind of suffered, took these hits at the same time, that created even bigger problems, right? More unemployment, more people are out of work, less stuff is being built, companies go under, people lose their jobs, people now are homeless, they lose their homes, they don't have health insurance, so it creates a real crisis, okay? Now the last thing on here has to do with banking. I call it credit crunch, and I could call it banking crisis, just the same, right? And this actually connects to the stock market too. In the 1920s, well, this is the way banking is today. So it's a lot like it was in the 1920s. For a long time, it wasn't. But in the 1920s, banking did not have a distinction. Banks didn't have a distinction between commercial banking and investment banking. What's that mean? Commercial banking is if you have like a savings account or a checking account, right? You do your commercial banking there, commerce, you conduct, you can take loans from them, you can have a savings account, you can have a checkbook with it to pay your bills with and stuff like that. That's commercial banking, right? Investment banking is like buying stocks. That's another form of banking. Now, for a long time, until about 20 years ago, those two things were separate, right? So commercial banking, like, getting a loan for a car or having a checking account was different than going in and buying stocks in like General Motors or Apple or Google or whatever, right? Well, in the 1920s, they weren't separate. You could do both. So banks both took in money. I could set up a checking account there. I could set up a savings account there. I could take out a loan. If I have a checking account or a savings account, I give them my money. They take my money. Right? Now they loan some of it out, but they invest it. That money doesn't sit there. They don't take your money and put it in a bag with your name on it and put it in a vault, right? So that money is invested. Banks are huge investors. And people would go to banks to buy stocks. So if you had some money, you might have a savings account or a checking account, or you may just purchase stocks. So when you go to the bank, they're doing both things. They serve two purposes. They're doing commercial banking, they're doing investment banking, okay? So what's the problem there? Well, there's a couple. One, when banks get extra, there's a surplus capital, right? So a lot of banks have a lot of extra money that they start to invest. But when people go to invest, they might ask for advice, like, what should I invest in? Well, if a bank is heavily invested in a particular business, then they're probably going to recommend many of their clients to invest in that business too, right? So if I'm investing in, this particular company, XYZ company, and then people come in and ask me for advice, I'm going to say, well, you should invest in XYZ company, which means the price of XYZ stock goes up, which means the bank makes a lot more money, right? So there's not really a distinction then between the two. But when the stock market crashes, everybody's out of luck. So these banks, which have invested heavily and also encouraged their investors to invest in those same stocks so that they can make money too. When the market crashes, the banks and the investors are both hurt. Maybe they go broke. So it's really hard now to get loans. Now there's an economic crisis. People are out of work. They're desperate. And to make things worse, they can't get loans. So if you're a farmer, or if you're a small artisan, you're a tailor, or you make, whatever, shoes, suits, furniture, whatever. If you need a loan to keep you going, then good luck, because the banks don't have it. There is a massive credit crisis. Remember, like in April of this year, when they announced the first bailout program, those were loans, right? You don't really pay them back, but those were loans, and there were trillions of dollars worth that went to companies like Boeing and United Airlines, and Kanye got some, and Joel Osteen's church got some, and corporations got some. The idea there was to put that money into their hands so that they could keep economic activity going. That's the idea behind it, right? because in the 1920s, there was nothing really like that. So when the stock market crashed, these banks, which have invested in the market and told their people to invest in the market, are in deep trouble. A lot of these investors have lost their money, the people who put money into a savings or checking account at the bank. People like small farmers who are really in trouble now can't go to the bank and get a loan because there's just nothing available. So there is a huge banking crisis as well. So put all those things together. And I talked about this in some detail because I think it's really important. And you see some of this stuff is really kind of timeless. It's very similar to a lot of the things we see today, especially these banking issues, right? So in the 1920s, then you had, after this huge economic expansion in the early 20s, then you started to see things kind of flatten out because most people had kind of what they need. So you have surplus capital. You can't invest it abroad because the reparations payment and the debts triangle and all that kind of stuff, the lack of foreign trade, don't give you any options. So instead, they've invested in the stock market, which goes way, 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 way up. But it's a balloon. It's a bubble. It burst. People are poor and they're losing jobs, so they can't afford to buy the stuff they need. The two major industries in the United States, automobiles and construction, are hurt, which means that they're going to hurt the whole economy. And then the banking system is wiped out. So there's really not a whole lot, people can do to get aid. So they rely on private aid. They rely on, going to, maybe a homeless shelter or a soup kitchen. If you're not that bad off, you may have family, or maybe you can move into family. But most people don't have the means to borrow money or get access to a job or production or anything like that. So most people are suffering really badly. Okay, so those are, and I just went through it actually very quickly. And there are other issues too. I mean, I could talk about these countries getting into currency wars and changing the values of their currencies and all that, which is actually kind of one of the issues today. The dollar is starting to weaken, and the US and China have been fighting for a long time over what kind of currency to use. I'm not going to go into that. Don't worry about it. You're not going to be any test questions on currencies, all right? So I could have talked about more, but I picked these because I think they fit together and they're fairly understandable, and they're kind of have a timeless quality to them. These are still issues in the United States, or anywhere really. Anytime you have economic problems, stuff like this matters a great deal. I mean, you have a stock market based on investment rather than production, and you have this decrease in trade, whether it be based on the reparations after Versailles or on tariffs or whatever, surplus capital, all that kind of stuff comes together. So it's a massive economic problem. So by 1929 is when the market crashes. By the early 1930s, there is a huge depression in the United States. Maybe a third of Americans were out of work. And it's hard to kind of figure out really accurate unemployment numbers. And it still is today, because a lot of people kind of work kind of off book, right? They clean houses or they babysit. Nowadays, you have people who are doing gig economy stuff, Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, things like that. So getting like really good, clean numbers is kind of hard. There's also a difference between unemployment and underemployment, where people may be working, but they're, work 15 hours a week, make a minimum wage or something like that. So in the 1930s, there was a massive crisis. Maybe a third of Americans or more unemployed. Businesses entirely shut down. Factories shut down, banks shut down, farms foreclosed on. So there's a real crisis going on. People don't have food. You're in the midst of this dust bowl, which is creating this environmental catastrophe and a public health catastrophe, because instead of like taking, account of nature, these farmers on the plains just wiped out every tree in sight. And so when there was a drought, you created these like really hard surfaces, and then winds kicked up and boom, you have these dust storms, and then the fields are basically not, useful for agricultural production, right? So all of this is happening at the same time. It is a massive humanitarian crisis as well as an economic crisis, and that's the important thing. The economy is suffering, but that means people are suffering, right? Banks and factories are walls and windows and floors. They're not like people. So, keep that in mind, that the real issue here that's really a crisis is humans, is American people. They're unemployed, they're out of work, they don't have food, they don't have health care. Many of them are dying from, dust bowl. They can't go to doctors, they can't get treated. They're being evicted from their homes. It takes a psychological impact. So it's a pretty rough time. Okay. The president, what did he do? Well, I kind of said some decent stuff about Herbert Hoover last week, I think, last time. And you know, this is the guy who more or less developed that trade associations idea. Who was the guy who said that the problem with capitalism is the capitalists, they're just too damn greedy. And he wanted to create kind of a stable, harmonious, rational capitalist system, right? But the capitalists themselves, as we've seen, remain, as Hoover would say, you know, they're capitalists. The problem of capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy. And they kept doing the kind of things they had been doing, even though they had trade associations and even though Hoover had stepped in and tried to regulate them and get them to kind of cooperate and create stability. But still, they invested all this money in the stock market. Banks were taking money from investors and then using that money to purchase stock, which later fell apart, which later blew up. So by 1929, even though Hoover's a really smart guy and he has all these ideas, he could not hold back this kind of flood of capital and flood of bad speculative investment. The stock market is a form of speculation, if you've ever heard that word, right? If you have money and you need something to do with it, you speculate. Oh, I'm going to buy a lithium mine in Bolivia or something, or I'll work for the government in Bolivia so I can get a lithium mine. Elon Musk is big on that kind of stuff. You find ways to invest it, right? Well, that's kind of faded out. And so people, you can't speculate in the European market because nothing's happening there. Global trade is suffering. So where are you going to speculate? You're going to buy more land? What for? Farms aren't doing any good either, so buying more land. So they speculate in the stock market. They go into the stock market, and that's where they speculate. They take a guess. When you speculate on something, you're kind of taking a guess. You speculate. You have an idea about something, and you act on it. And so the speculation, and there can be land speculation, there can be all kinds of land speculation. It was very common, right? But in the 1920s, it was on the stock market. So they have all of this excess money. They have to figure out something to do with it, something to make it work. And so the stock market became their approach. And as we can see, it flamed out and it blew up. And so Hoover has to deal with this. Hoover's a smart guy, but his response just really made things kind of worse. Hoover at first said that, and you'll hear this phrase all the time when the market goes bad. You'll hear it all the time, like especially on the news, the business news channels. They'll say it was a market correction, right? And that's what Hoover said. It means that the market had been kind of gone out of whack. It's like getting real sick, you get a bad fever, and then you kind of, you spike your fever, and then you're better again, right? That's kind of like a market correction. So basically that was the idea, that the market, just was out of whack. And, by, cratering in October of 1929, it was kind of in the process of fixing itself. So it was a market correction, and then everything will be better again, right? So, if something's going really good or something's going really bad, there'll be a market correction and you'll be back to normal, right? So that's the idea. Well, it wasn't a market correction, it was a depression. The causes of it: surplus capital, lack of trade, this lack of production in Europe, these banks failing, those weren't easily corrected. They're gone now. And so Hoover had to figure out something to do. And so he had a few ideas, and these are kind of useful because, again, in other periods, 2008, 2020, you hear about stuff like this. So Hoover's first plan, well, first of all, he asked for voluntary cooperation. Hoover said, we know there's an economic catastrophe, but please don't shut down your factory. Don't shut down your bank. Don't lay off workers. Keep your business open. Keep paying people. And of course, businesses didn't listen to that at all because they were, there's this economic crisis and they don't want to keep their businesses open and pay workers. So that voluntary idea didn't get very far. Then he decided to balance the budget. Back then, we don't really talk about that too much today, less so than we used to. Sometimes it'll come up. But the idea in kind of classical capitalism is that your budget should be balanced. You should, spend about the same as you take in, right? That's kind of a basis of it. In order to have a recognized strong economy, you should have a balanced budget. If you have a big deficit, if you're in debt too much, then other people won't want to invest in your thing, right? So Hoover wanted to balance the budget. So even though people are out of work, people they've been evicted, they don't have homes, they're trying to, dig food out of garbage cans. Hoover is concerned about making sure that, they pay their taxes or even increasing tax rates in order to keep the budget balanced. So, obviously it doesn't work, right? So you can't balance the budget when people don't have any jobs, people don't have any money. You can't increase their taxes, or you can't insist that people pay, taxes that they don't have, right? So this idea of a balanced budget, which is very traditional capitalist idea, is useless. It doesn't do anything. Then, again, kind of similar to stuff we're dealing with today, Hoover and the Republican Party decided to go with tariffs, right? They thought that if you imposed tariffs on foreign goods, then you would protect American manufacturers, right? That's the idea behind a tariff. You tax something coming in from another country, and you make that so expensive that people will purchase the stuff made in the United States instead, all right? The problem with tariffs, though, is that in order for tariffs to work, they have to be able to kind of have an impact on trade. Well, in the 1920s and 1930s, trade was dead anyway. Remember, went from 3 billion to 900 million. So you're imposing tariffs on a smaller and smaller number of goods anyway, and then those countries that you impose tariffs on then retaliate by imposing tariffs on the United States on the stuff it sells. And we've seen that in the last couple of years, not just with China, but with Canada and other countries too. You impose tariffs on stuff that Canada sells to the United States, then Canada imposes tariffs on stuff the United States sells there. You put tariffs on stuff from China that come in, China's going to put tariffs on soybeans from the United States. So Hoover and Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, probably the biggest tariff package of all time, and it was just an utter failure. It did nothing to raise money. It did nothing to protect jobs because people, even with protective tariffs, Americans are too poor to buy the stuff that these companies are making, and the factories are shut down anyway, right? So balanced budget, voluntary cooperation didn't work. Balanced budget didn't work. Tariffs didn't work. So the next thing Hoover does would be kind of a blueprint for what's going to come later. It's government spending. Now, this is a shift. I've told you before that the government has always been very involved in capitalism. The idea that the government has nothing to do with it's wrong. That's not capitalist theory. The government's heavily involved in capitalism. It determines, which company gets subsidies, which companies get government grants. It intervenes. It sends militias and police out to stop strikes, to stop workers from organizing unions. So the government's deeply involved in it. The government doesn't usually directly spend money, though, in times of economic crisis. And this is what a lot of people in the 20s and 30s were calling for, led by people who had followed the economic work of John Maynard Keynes. I mentioned Keynes before, Keynesianism, and I'll talk about it again, right? The idea behind this is that government should take an active role and spend money to fix the economy, to get people up and going again, all right? Now, Hoover finally, around 1931, did that. He created something called the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and it set aside a significant amount of money. I believe it was about 300 million at the time. I'm not sure of that. It's in the book. And so what that money there is, it's like a bank, right? And so businesses and banks can borrow money from the government. The idea there is that the US government will make this money available, kind of like what we saw this year, right? And then banks and businesses can borrow that money. Now, the idea behind it is then they can get back to business, right? They can reopen their factories or their banks or whatever and put people back to work and start doing stuff. But they didn't, right? Most of them took that money and sat on it. So critics, like working class people, called it a breadline for big business. Poor people who were starving had to go to a breadline to get something to eat. But these businesses go to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and get millions of dollars, which they're encouraged to use, but in fact, most of them just sit on it. They keep it. So government spending doesn't do much either, but it does create this idea, this precedent now, because that's going to be very important after Hoover leaves the White House and Franklin Roosevelt becomes president. But by 1931, the economy's it's a mess. It's really in horrible shape. You have this series of economic crises battering the United States, this lack of trade, this stock market crash, this banking crisis, people are poor, businesses are shutting down all the time. People don't, have food and healthcare. So it's this huge, immense national crisis. Most people are out of work, they're underemployed, they're not fed well, they're sick, all kinds of public health problems. So it's pretty bad, right? So in 1932 is an election year, and Herbert Hoover is running for president with this horrific, economic depression still going on. It started in 1929, and by 1932, really hadn't changed much. So Hoover's probably not looked at as a strong candidate, and the Democrats basically have to, nominate somebody who can, kind of say, that he's different than Hoover, but doesn't really have to do much. And the candidate to pick was pretty easy. It was Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt had been the governor of New York. He was pretty well known. He came from a very famous family. He was a cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, who had been the president 20 years earlier. Roosevelt's father, I don't know if I said this before or not, made a lot of money Roosevelt's grandfather in the 1830s and 40s, made a ton of money. He was shipping opium to China. So he made a lot of money in the opium trade. And he came from this really wealthy New York family. As governor of New York in the Depression, 1929 on, he created a bunch of reform programs, had a pretty good reputation. So he was kind of the logical person to run for president, and the Democrats chose him as their candidate. This is a picture of him. This is maybe the only photo. Roosevelt had polio, and which really kind of changed his life. He was kind of a rich kid, spoiled rich boy, but after he got polio, he seemed to kind of take life more seriously because he endured this. And I think this is the only picture. He generally wouldn't allow the media to take pictures of him in his wheelchair or holding crutches because he didn't want people to think he was sick or whatever, right? I mean, obviously that kind of thing wouldn't be possible today. But I think this may be one of the few or only pictures taken of him in his wheelchair. Roosevelt served as president longer than anybody in U.S. history. He was elected 4 times. He served 12 years right after he was inaugurated for the 4th time in 1945. He died not long after that. He died in April of 1945, but he had been elected he was elected in 1932, kind of getting ahead of things, obviously, 1936, 1940, 1944. So he was elected president 4 times. When he was running for president in 1932, he didn't have to the country was falling apart, so he didn't have to kind of give a lot of specifics. What he wanted to do is give people a sense of hope, right? Because there was a great, massive sense of fear and anxiety in the country. People are out of work. There's nothing on the horizon. People aren't eating. It's bad. So Roosevelt, throughout the campaign, really ran kind of an upbeat campaign. His campaign song, the first candidate, I think, to have a campaign theme, an anthem, a song, was called "Happy Days Are Here Again." And he talked a lot about, really optimistic notes. In 2008, Barack Obama ran kind of an Fdr campaign during the Great Recession that year. He talked a lot about hope and all that kind of stuff. And that's what Roosevelt understood, the kind of psychological impact of this. So, he told people, we're going to get better and we can do this together and all that kind of stuff. And, never really kind of focused on how bad it was, or never really even kind of wanted to admit how bad it was. He didn't want this kind of negative message to get out, right? So he ran on this kind of idea that, there was this illusion or reality, whatever, but it's kind of illusion at the time that things are going to get better and there's hope, right? But it worked. I mean, that's kind of what Americans wanted. And Hoover was just, the economy was so bad, the country was in bad shape. You had the Dust Bowl and everything. So, Hoover doesn't have a lot to run on, right? So Roosevelt runs this campaign, doesn't really, kind of offer a lot of specific things. He does talk about the need for what came to be known as the 3 R's. Roosevelt says that, we have this massive crisis on our hands, this global depression. People are out of work, companies are closed down, banks are shut down. So what he wants to do is go at it in 3 phases. He does say this during the campaign. He has 3 phases. The first is relief. The second, recovery. The third, reform. What do those mean? Relief means that we have a massive emergency on our hands right now. People aren't eating. people don't have places to live. So relief means like literally like saving people's lives. Like when you do triage, you know, if you ever see a TV show set in a hospital or something like that, you get people who are the worst off and you treat them first. So relief means literally like setting up soup kitchens, creating like shelters so that people can, you know, have a place to sleep if they're homeless. Maybe give people a blanket, maybe have a doctor to, you know, check the kids out or something like that. So relief means you give relief to the people who are worst off, and you get to it as soon as you can. Right? It's just like kind of, you know, emergency, like an emergency room. Let's get these people, you know, literally save their lives. Okay. Once you do that, you go to recovery. Now, recovery means you fix the businesses so they can reopen. You do what you have to do so that these banks and factories and farms and so on can reopen. They do recover. You need an economic recovery, right? So you do what you have to do and fix those businesses so that they can reopen and start hiring people and making things that people can buy and so on, right? The third phase of it is long-term, and it's reform, which means you change the system. You change the laws, you change the code, you create regulations or whatever to fix it so you don't have those problems again, right? So relief means you just like save people's lives by giving them what they need immediately. Recovery means you get those businesses back working again, you get them, you know, recovered. Reform means you fix the problems that were in existence before that. You reform these laws, these regulations, these codes so that this doesn't happen again, right? You create a new system, a new segment of the economy to fix that over the long-term reform, right? So you have relief, recovery, reform. And during the campaign, Roosevelt had uttered the phrase, I'm going to offer the American people a New Deal. And that's what this program came to be known as, Roosevelt's New Deal. There were actually like 2 or 3, depending on how you want to count it. We're going to talk about 2 of them today too. Not today, but you know, as we move forward on this, we're going to talk about 2 of them. So Roosevelt became president. He won easily in 1932 because, you know, Hoover was seen as this problem. He had like helped really, you know, destroy the economy. Roosevelt runs against them with this kind of optimistic, sunny, happy days are here again idea. He wins easily because, you know, Hoover really has nothing to run on. The tariffs were a disaster. The balanced budget was a disaster. Government spending, you know, these businesses and banks just took the money and kept it. So it didn't, you know, recreate jobs or anything like that. So Roosevelt won easily, and then he becomes president. Now, historically, Roosevelt has a reputation as being very liberal or even radical or even on the left. People would call him, you know, nowadays, even people will say he's a socialist, he's this and that, right? And we'll get to the basis for that, because what Roosevelt did, was the first president to really do this, is create government programs to help people get to work, to help people who were suffering from the Depression, right? But that's not his first approach. Roosevelt's first approach in the New Deal was actually conservative. It was actually to take care of businesses, all right? So we're going to start that next time. So even though Roosevelt has this reputation as this great reformer, this great progressive, this liberal or radical or whatever, his first thoughts when he became president were that he had to take care of business, that the problem of the Depression was a problem of production, that all of these companies weren't able to produce and sell the stuff they made. So he wanted to fix them. So it was his first ideas about the Depression were to help companies, to help banks, to help big farmers, and not to help people directly. His idea was that he would start at the top, try to get these businesses back on their feet, and then they, in turn, once they got together, would be able to rehire people and get people back to work, right? Roosevelt didn't go straight to those people, those consumers, those workers, those producers. He didn't address them first. He addressed the companies and the corporations first. So it was very conservative, actually, and very pro-business, despite what his historical legacy, his historical reputation is, all right? So I'm going to stop there rather than go on to this thing, because it's just easier to pick it up next time. This is the 8th lecture. Like I said, keep up on this, watch these things, do all the readings. I can't stress that enough. Do all the readings. Check Blackboard for any information about testing or extra credit or whatever. If you have any questions, shoot them to the TA about that kind of stuff. You can contact me too, but if it's just kind of a technical thing, well, most of them actually are either, like almost every email I get, frankly, you can probably find on the syllabus or on Blackboard. So check there first, hit the TAs up. You can hit me up. And of course, and if you have any book issues, contact Nunn McGinney. I don't know anything about that stuff. So if you're having, you log in or whatever, you need information, contact Nunn McGinney. We'll have another one of these up soon. And, if you have any questions or anything like that, hit us up, and, be safe, and, wear your masks and be careful, and enjoy the weather as it gets a little bit cooler. So take care, and we'll see you next time.